Welcome to another video of GeoSpinach. Today we're going to talk about retreat, the hardest operation in war. Now, retreat, and many officers tend to ignore this because everyone likes attacking, is an essential part of war. And either we like it or not, it's something that every officer and commander of every rank needs to know how to execute. And unfortunately, the majority of people do not know or tend to ignore the basics, and when they come to retreat, everything tends to fail. So, retreat will, while being the hardest operation to conduct, if it's conducted properly, the army can survive and thus fight for another day. If it fails, then the army gets completely destroyed. The best example of a failed retreat will be the Napoleonic Wars, where the Grand Armée, in its attempt to retreat due to lack supplies and all of the things we're going to talk about today, massively collapsed and got eliminated due to the bad factors of retreat and good attacking tactics of the Russians, exploiting the disorganized state of the French army. Nonetheless, the major issue Napoleon lost in that campaign was because of the failed retreat operation. Some may argue, okay, he was too far in, and that's part of the concept. Now, moving in, when does an army retreat? So, this is something that's really important for people to understand. There is not one aspect when an army should retreat. So, first, they should retreat because its position is unattainable. So, then it expects an attack and it will retreat. By the way, in this video, we are going to see quite a lot of examples of various battles and various war examples that I have created showing the scenarios that I'm describing over here. Now, you retreat when the position is unattainable. It means that you don't have the ability to attack the enemy, and thus you're like, if I hold this position longer, I'm receiving way more casualties, so I should retreat to better lines. Your flanks have been overrun, so this means that a part of your army got destroyed, and as a result, you are forced to massively retreat, even if your unit is still intact. The army generally collapses, so there's attack across the front, the army has collapsed, and everyone just in a panic, so this is what we call a forced retreat. Then we have just better defensive positions. So again, if you're not planning to attack, but you can still hold a position, then in many cases it's much better to consolidate your forces, so over here, as well as go to better defensive positions, and doing so will allow you to hold a front line with much less troops. We'll see that in just a bit. And then we have the scenario where you retreat as to ambush the enemy. This occurs mainly with small scale units, but nonetheless, it's quite hard to conduct such a retreat, mainly because you expose yourself while you retreat, and if it's part of the plan. So these two things go hand in hand. Now, let's see, for example, a failed retreat. A failed retreat is the total collapse of the Russian army in 1915 when they got massively overrun by the central forces, and the general front line of the Russian troops was this one that I'm indicating right here. So it was massively exposed. So we're talking about the First World War. And this has led them to a massive retreat, which in that retreat they received so many losses of not only manpower but equipment, and this is something that many people tend to ignore. When you retreat and you care about your life, you tend to just leave everything behind, just run for your life. As a result, the moment you stop retreating, you are not in a state to fight. A good retreat means that the state of your army stays the same, and thus you are able to conduct your offensive operations better in the future. And thus, while the Russians did retreat to a much better line, hypothetically, because it was much shorter, the state of that army, by the point it has retreated, got so much destroyed that the whole army got overrun. And this is a term you will listen to military terminology, a unit getting overrun. Then we have a scenario of a successful retreat. Here in the early stages of 1917, where the Germans understood that their positions over here were unattainable, and both geographically and in general, and because of the whole case of the war. So they retreated to not only better geographic positions, but also to pre-existing dug-in defensive positions. So they spent some months Hindenburg did. So this is called the Hindenburg line, where they dug in very good defensive positions, and one day using rearguard action, where we're gonna see later in the video how you conduct a rearguard action. I'm going to make a specific video on it, but using rearguard action, they gradually retreat the whole army to a whole defensive position, both applying ambush to the enemy as well as consolidating to better defensive positions as well as their forces, and avoiding the case where their position was unattainable. So this is a great example of a successful retreat. Now, let's see an example where a mass retreat leads to a bottleneck and thus to a total encirclement. Later on, we're going to see why encirclements, if your troops get encircled, are not necessarily bad in the short term. So getting many troops encircled might actually save the rest of the army. Quite counterintuitive, but it's quite a strong and fundamental concept of war. Now, here we have a scenario where always remember the fog of war. I stop applying it to my videos as to reduce the complexity, but never forget the fog of war. The black team doesn't really know what's happening over here. The same applies for the red team. They don't know exactly what's happening over here. Now, what we see in the scenario here is that the black team has initiated a massive assault over here, and they broke the enemy's line. And the enemy's line is kind of crumbling, but we assume they brought in some reserves, so they are barely holding on. And they launched their own counteroffensive, the red army, over here in the north. Doing so, exposed the flanks of the black army completely. And this is a scenario we mentioned prior. Now, the flanks of the whole black army, of the whole red army, are completely exposed. And a potential attack that will go of this manner, which is the idea of a double envelopment, so encircle the units together, will lead the majority of the strong armored forces of the black unit to get completely encircled. Now, in this scenario, the black team gets massively panicked of this possibility, and as a result, decides to do a mass retreat. So everyone just rushes in just to save their lives. So all of these smaller and smaller units over here start retreating. So everyone just rushes for their lives. As a result, the firepower on these units gets massively decreased. And at the same time, because all of these retreating units creating bottlenecks and losing their cohesion and abandoning their equipment and so forth, the battle as it develops, it locks them down into a position where, yes, some of their forces might be in a position to kind of actually get away from the pocket, but they are completely struggled and bogged down, because the enemy has surrounded them, used the terrain against them, and because the retreating units had abandoned quite a lot of their equipment, and as a result their fighting capability gets even more reduced, allowing the enemy to exploit the position even further, leading to a scenario where gradually gets completely encircled. And because of, while the troops in the center had supplies, as I indicate over here, they didn't have enough to supply such a massive force. Thus, the ability of this massive force to conduct a breakout is so limited, and the amount of available forces outside the encirclement is so few to be able to help those encircled forces to conduct the outbreak of the encirclement makes the whole position untenable and thus in general loss. And this endgame. I'm gonna make more videos specifically looking at encirclement operations and how to conduct them. As far as I understand, many people like them, so I will make even more. Now, what do we learn out of these concepts? Why is retreat so hard to be executed? Well, firstly, you reduce your firepower. Reducing your firepower means that as you fire to the enemy and then you stop firing and you start retreating, the firepower of the enemy, while staying the same, the precision of the firepower becomes massively stronger because it doesn't receive fire back, so it's not pinned down. And because you are abandoning your defensive positions, thus you become more exposed, your casualties inevitably go up. So as firepower gets reduced, casualties go up. Now, furthermore, you lose organization, you create bottlenecks, panic drives in and destroys the army, which leads to a lower morale and even lower organization. Supplies get easily abandoned and overused, and equipment gets exposed and so forth. And especially, it's really hard to be executed if it's done by infantry units against armor units, because an infantry brigade with good anti-tank in a well-dug defensive positions, as we have seen in the past, can hold an armored division, but in an open field, while it's retreating, is so easily exposed that can get completely overrun. I have a specific video discussing exactly that scenario. Now, let's see a scenario where how to conduct a rear guard action. Now, a rear guard action, it's the terminology of how to conduct a retreat operation, and we refer to it mainly when it comes to the company, platoon, and maybe battalion level. Of course, you can refer to a rear guard action to a holder army group, but it's quite a different thing. Now, I'm not going to go much into details. I'm going to make a specific video analyzing how to conduct a rear guard action, but let me just show you the scenario. The main idea of the rear guard action is that while you know that your forces will get overrun if you stay at those positions, but you know that if you start massively retreating, your forces will get panicked and be completely overrun even more. And as a result, what you do is gradually retreat your forces, and as you gradually retreat, unnecessarily you start sacrificing troops and gradually retreating and causing damage to the enemy. So you never stop being engaged from the enemy, so you never give the enemy the freedom of maneuver, so the freedom to be really aggressive. And then gradually you retreat, and you come to a scenario here where out of the 20 platoons, 15 have survived, including the 3 of the heavy armaments, which is the most important for that battalion to be able to conduct offensive and even more defensive capabilities in the future, while the attacker has gained that position, but it had suffered quite a lot doing so. Now, what do we learn from this? So some fundamentals on retreat operation. There's a note here, some fundamentals on the retreat operations. Reserves are vital. I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by these examples that these things I'm illustrating here. So reserves are always vital. You never know what's going to happen in the battle. You never know when something is going to go wrong. So the one that maintains the bigger reserve in a war is the one that's going to win the battle, as Napoleon has said in his maxims of war. So keeping good reserves will allow you, in the worst case scenario, to avoid the extremes. Pre-existing supplies are mandatory. So even if your troops are well supplied, you should always have pre-existing supplies in positions, in supply dumps behind the enemy, behind your forces, just in case there is a retreat, just in case you get overrun, your troops to be able to continuously be supplied and be able to continue fighting. Sacrifices are necessary. This is something that the NATO School of War kind of completely ignores, believing the idea that they can save everyone. And as we have seen extensively in the wars of the 20th century, that focusing on keeping your soldiers alive in many cases just leads to way more of your soldiers being dead. So either you like it or not, sacrifices are necessary, especially in the worst case situation. And we're going to show an example later. Sacrificing a unit to be encircled will help the rest of the army survive and thus cause less casualties. So heavy losses will be taken, and this is something that you should be familiar of and expect. So always don't assume that I have 4 divisions, I'm retreating, and those 4 divisions will be the same after the retreat. Encircle units help with delaying the enemy. This is a very vital point. Yes, if an infantry division that has quite strong artillery positions gets outflanked and has a choice between retreating and abandoning all of its equipment or staying at its position, assuming that it has the supplies, it might be better to stay at that position, because staying at that position will mean that the attacker will not gain control of the roads, thus making his attack against the whole front much harder, as well as causing way more forces of the enemy to be pinned down on that unit, as a result alleviating some of the burden on the rest of your army. I'm going to show an example later on this. If the enemy is aware of your retreat, you are doomed. So the enemy should never know what you are actually doing. That's the general concept of the fog of war. But if you are planning a general retreat and the enemy knows that that's the case, then the enemy might rush in and get you off guard, especially using armor units, leading into an onslaught. So you should always maintain engagement with the enemy. So never completely disengage the enemy. Never create a delusion to the minds of the enemy that you are still there. Even if you reduce the amount of forces, and that's the centerpiece of rear guard action, you always maintain fighting, so the enemy can't really know how many troops are there. So it will be reluctant to attack on the sides and leaving its rear guard, its vanguard, exposed on its flanks, and as a result getting himself encircled and destroyed. So always maintain engagement with the enemy. So constantly fight the enemy even if you are retreating. Never stop the firepower. This implies to artillery and air support. So if you are retreating, air support is vital, and air coverage is even more vital. And lastly, always retreat to better positions. If you're going to abandon your positions for worse positions, and your current positions are not attainable, then you should probably seek for peace rather than retreat, because retreating will just lead to you to completely eradication of your army. Now, let's see some more specific examples. So what if the black team had just 3 more brigades in reserve? Okay, so let's say they had 2 infantry brigades, so not very strong units, and 1 mechanized brigade in the reserve. This will have changed almost everything, mainly because the flanks here will have been protected, and while the red team would have pushed in through here, they could have at least maintained a barricade over this line because of the mountainside over here and the retreat of this good quality unit will use the mountainside as an anchor here, creating a massive defensive position looking something like this. And then if this works, it will gradually allow some of the units, especially the more mobilized units, to gradually move in and maintain that protective barrier and allowing the army to retreat. But in this scenario, we will also assume that you have to abandon something. And in this case, it will be the northern part, to at least allow, since you know that the enemy will seek to encircle the greater forces, use that to your advantage to retreat with the majority of your non so much engaged forces to create that vanguard. We're going to create more specialized videos in the future analyzing specifically operations such as this. Now, let's see an example of a well-supplied encirclement. In this scenario, we have a mechanized brigade or regiment, doesn't really matter, over here. And an offensive occurs with the red team, which has way more manpower than the black team. The black team gets overrun, but because that mechanized regiment and that armed infantry regiment with very well good supplied positions over here stayed in their defensive positions, they are forcing the red team to spend way more forces enabling the encirclement and thus creating some sort of parity of force across the front line. This is very important because if the red team had chosen to put more forces from here on the front line, then the black team within the city, because of interior lines and the concept of defeat in detail, as I elaborate on my other video, specifically on interior lines of defense and defeat in detail, they could have strike on their back and thus destroying them and gaining a local advantage. So thus, the strategy of sacrificing those troops delays the whole attacking maneuver and thus protects the whole of the army. Now, if we see the same scenario with no extra supplies, we come to a situation where 3 regiments get encircled, but because of the lack of supplies and because there are 3 regiments and they are eating away even more supplies, the red team can maintain the encirclement with more troops, but with not as many troops as it's required. And as a result, you don't have that good disparity of force across the front line. Now, this has been the main concepts of retreat. I haven't touched all of the concepts, so some of the other many very important concepts of retreat is how to use mobile defense systems, how to use the defense in detail, as I showed in the video. I'm going to make a lot of videos in regards to those subjects. But for now, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time.